4 people report having paid a bribe in the last 12 months while interacting with key public institutions or services. Criminal proceeds laundered through financial systems are estimated to amount to almost 3% of global GDP. The challenges of armed violence, extortion, sexual violence, illicit trafficking, money laundering, corruption, limited access to justice, impunity, and a lack of accountability by public officials are not limited to any one country or any particular group of countries. These are universal problems, universal challenges. Indeed, in today's globalized world, phenomena such as transnational organized crime and the instability which it can bring has the potential to affect all countries without distinction. Evidence suggests that insecurity, injustice, and a lack of respect for the rule of law can have a significant impact on the progress of development. The UNODC Global Homicide Report for 2011 found associations between high levels of violence and income inequality. The World Bank's World Development Report for 2011 found that high levels of violence slow poverty reduction. Research conducted in furtherance of the Geneva Declaration on Armed Violence and Development, which was signed by Brazil in 2006, suggests a relationship between lethal violence and 7 of the Millennium Development Goals, as well as 21 individual MDG indicators. A broad correlation exists between measurements of the rule of law and human development, with core components such as government regulatory powers combined with an absence of corruption being the most proximate in relation to development. These intersections have not been lost on the international community. Whilst the MDGs themselves did not include goals related to justice, security, and the rule of law, a number of international developments have occurred in this area over the last months and years, and let me talk about a few of them. The United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, which is popularly called Rio Plus 20, was held in Rio de Janeiro in June 2012. Rio Plus 20 reaffirmed in its outcome document the future we want, the importance of freedom, peace, and security, respect for all human rights, the rule of law, gender equality, women's empowerment, and the overall commitment to just and democratic societies for development. The outcome document of a special event convened by the President of the General Assembly in September 2013 also called for a development agenda that promotes peace and security, democratic governance, the rule of law, gender equality, and human rights for all. The 2012 United Nations Declaration of the High-Level Meeting of the General Assembly on the Rule of Law stressed that the advancement of the rule of law is essential for the full realization of sustainable development. More than 3 million global responses to an online survey organized by the United Nations ranked an honest and responsive government as the 4th most important from a list of 16 possible development priorities. Protection against crime and violence was ranked 7th, ahead of other priorities such as better transport and roads and reliable energy at home. I would also draw your kind attention to the upcoming 13th Crime Congress, which will be held in Doha, Qatar, in April of 2015. The theme of the next Congress is a rather long sentence: integrating crime prevention and criminal justice into the wider United Nations agenda to address social and economic challenges and to promote the rule of law at the national and international levels and public participation. What that means more concisely is that the next Crime Congress will address successes and challenges in implementing comprehensive crime prevention and criminal justice policies and strategies in order to promote the rule of law at the national and international levels and to support sustainable development. 4 regional preparatory meetings have already been held for the Crime Congress, and the member states later this year will begin drafting the outcome declaration of that Congress. This will constitute an excellent forum for feeding technical aspects of crime prevention, criminal justice, and the rule of law into the post-2015 development agenda. And we expect Brazil will play an active and a constructive role in that process, as she always does. All of these various discussions in all of these various fora come at a key crossroads in the global development journey. The Millennium Development Goals were adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in its Millennium Declaration in the year 2000, and they have a target date of the year 2015 for their achievement. At the international level, the conversation is now well underway concerning what the post-2015 development agenda will look like. Brazil has already played a key role in this process. The Rio Plus 20 Conference on Sustainable Development, which was held in June 2012, launched a process to develop a set of sustainable development goals, what we call the SDGs, to be agreed by the United Nations General Assembly and to be coherent with and integrated into the United Nations Development Agenda beyond 2015. An open working group consisting of member states representing the 5 United Nations geographical regions was established for this task in January 2013 by the General Assembly, and Brazil held a seat on that group, which it shared with Nicaragua. The open working group was faced not only with the question of the place of justice, security, and the rule of law within a new set of global sustainable development goals, but also with many other novel challenges, including the reduction of inequality, the development of safe, resilient, and sustainable cities, sustainable consumption and production patterns, climate change, and the sustainable use of oceans and terrestrial ecosystems. Indeed, the question with so many and such cross-cutting themes is how they should be expressed within the development agenda. The Millennium Development Goals, for example, focused on traditional development outcomes, such as the eradication of extreme poverty and hunger, universal primary education, and child mortality. As the Open Working Group set about its task of proposing sustainable development goals for the next 15 years, many questions naturally arose. Are justice, security, and the rule of law, for example, to be considered as enablers to facilitate development, or are they outcomes of development, like reductions in poverty or infant mortality? Should they be integrated across development goals, or should they be a goal in and of themselves? Should we be concerned only with criminal, or with criminal and conflict violence, or both? Does the rule of law include governance, or is it a separate concept that should also be reflected? These are without doubt difficult questions, and member states legitimately hold a wide range of views, many of which are still developing and evolving. A significant number of states are convinced of the universality and the need for a sustainable development goal related to security, justice, and the rule of law. Others have concerns that such concepts may be too broad to be encapsulated in a single goal, that issues of conflict prevention and conflict violence may be better addressed in other international fora, or that goals related to governance and national institutions may be used to justify interference with the internal affairs of sovereign states. Still others question the measurability of such concepts, a point that I will return to shortly. Notwithstanding some divergence of views, the Open Working Group just this month adopted its outcome document containing 17 proposals for sustainable development goals. This document will be considered at the General Assembly at its 68th session commencing in September of this year, as discussions focus on agreements toward a post-2015 development agenda to be agreed by September 2015. The document just agreed to includes a proposed Goal 16, which in its full text reads as follows: promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. This 16th goal includes 10 targets, which are intended to be aspirational global targets, but that nonetheless enable each government to set its own national targets guided by the global level of ambition, but taking into account national circumstances. In other words, where, for example, language such as significantly reduce is used in a target, governments have some flexibility in its interpretation according to their national circumstances. The 10 targets of Goal 16 include significantly reducing all forms of violence and related rates everywhere, promoting the rule of law and ensuring equal access to justice for all, significantly reducing illicit financial and arms flows, strengthening recovery and return of stolen assets, and combating all forms of organized crime, substantially reducing corruption and bribery, developing effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels, and strengthening relevant national institutions for preventing violence and combating terrorism and crime. These proposals represent a significant achievement and are a strong recognition that security, justice, and the rule of law are both enablers and outcomes of development. They are both a means to achieving just, equitable, inclusive, and sustained economic growth and social development, but in addition, they are valuable ends in and of themselves. When people feel secure, when they have access to justice and confidence in the supremacy, equality, and fair application of law, they're more able to make longer-term decisions and to contribute to productive growth. In this way, and as noted recently by the General Assembly, the rule of law and development are strongly interrelated and they're mutually reinforcing, with crime prevention and criminal justice approaches having an important role in this regard. All is not over yet, however, and in many ways the journey has just begun. The proposals of the open working group just agreed to provide a solid basis for the General Assembly to debate the place of justice, security, and the rule of law in a post-2015 development agenda. In considering the proposed Goal 16 on peaceful and inclusive societies, access to justice, and effective institutions, the General Assembly will likely pay particular attention to the goal's targets and indicators. In this debate, measurability may well turn out to be one of the key deciding factors. The Millennium Development Goal indicator framework showed just how important the capability to measure progress is to upholding commitments by governments. The clear definition of a small number of indicators per MDG target has not only assisted in providing a standard means of measuring progress, but it has also helped improve statistical capacity and data availability. Similarly, any post-2015 development framework will be most valuable if clear and simple targets and indicators can be defined and agreed upon at the global level, with the possibility for customization at the national level. The challenges of defining such targets and indicators in the area of justice, security, and the rule of law are not to be underestimated. Concepts such as the rule of law, for example, contain a number of elements that require measurement, including both the existence of laws having certain attributes in the first place, as well as their consistent and fair application in practice. The last decade has seen, however, considerable progress in the development of measurement methodologies, indicators, and analytical approaches. Thanks to the efforts at the international and regional and national levels, including such strong work as the detailed and excellent periodic statistics published by the Brazilian Fórum on Public Safety in the Anuário Brasileiro de Segurança Pública, I apologize for my pronunciation, we are increasingly able to demonstrate that issues of security, justice, and the rule of law are quantifiable. We've seen, for example, significant advances in measurements related to the experience of individuals of violence, corruption, discrimination, on the use of land and of their access to justice services, and of perceptions of government effectiveness, security, and social cohesion. Such measurements are increasingly utilized in international development processes, such as the peace-building and state-building goals of the G7 plus group of countries. Together, this work has led to available baskets of indicators and measures that can provide information on experience, perception, and underlying structural elements of justice, security, and the rule of law. With a view to supporting member states in further identifying measurable targets and associated indicators, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime has played a key role in what's called the technical support team of UN entities that assisted the work of the Open Working Group. In particular, in June last year, UNODC organized an expert consultation on accounting for security and justice in the post-2015 development agenda. This meeting identified a range of possible indicators that could support targets such as those proposed by the Open Working Group. A highly pragmatic approach was adopted in this respect. For each possible indicator, the experts asked themselves whether it was applicable, measurable, and relevant, and if so, what international or national data sources, as well as measurement tools, methodologies, and standards currently exist. Data sources for indicators of measurement in the area of justice, security, and the rule of law include administrative statistical systems such as police and court statistics, population-based sample surveys such as victimization, corruption, and access to justice surveys, expert review of laws and other structural elements, as well as emerging sources such as remote sensing. UNODC, for example, collects and presents homicide statistics for 219 countries and territories in its global study on homicide, as well as data on crime victimization and corruption experiences and perceptions in a range of countries and regions. Important methodological advances are also underway. The International Classification of Crime for Statistical Purposes, for example, will provide for the first time ever a common vocabulary on crime. This initiative, led by UNODC and set to be finalized by the end of 2014, will be a formidable tool to harmonize the production, analysis, and dissemination of statistics on crime and justice. In addition, initiatives such as those supported by UNODC, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Organization of American States, and the UN Development Program to promote and standardize victimization surveys in Latin America are increasingly leading to a fuller and a more in-depth understanding of crime and victimization. As the discussion on possible sustainable development goals and the post-2015 development agenda moves to the General Assembly, it's going to be important to ensure that the strong aspirations of the Open Working Group's proposed Goal 16 on peaceful and inclusive societies, access to justice and effective institutions, form an integral part of the next stage in our shared global development. This will involve political, conceptual, and technical discussions. Global goals, targets, and indicators on security, justice, and the rule of law must be realistic, neither being too ambitious nor insufficiently ambitious. They must balance outcome and process aspects, reflecting both the realities of security and justice experienced by individuals, as well as the positive actions and structures of the state in these areas. Targets must be measurable with sound data methodologies and metrics, but we also have to avoid the trap of being solely indicator-driven, which is valuing what we measure rather than measuring what we value. We must also achieve the right balance between global universality and national applicability, reflecting the global factors that drive violence and instability, such as illicit flows of drugs and criminal funds, whilst providing baskets of indicators that can be tailored to national needs and circumstances. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the close linkages between security, justice, and the rule of law and development mean that any post-2015 agenda that does not take account of these risks is missing an opportunity to further promote and ensure gains in future social and economic development. Brazil has traditionally taken a strong lead on these issues through its support to the United Nations Crime Congress, Rio +20, and processes such as the Geneva Declaration on Armed Violence and Development. In highlighting the importance of democracy, plurality, human rights, social and economic progress, and the primacy of the rule of law as clear values and goals to be upheld both nationally and globally by Brazil and by the world. The proposed goal 16 of the Open Working Group, for that reason, matters. As we move toward 2015 and beyond, I look forward to, and I especially hope for, an emerging global consensus, in the words of the General Assembly, on the advancement of the rule of law as essential for sustained and inclusive economic growth, sustainable development, the eradication of poverty and hunger, and the full realization of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. I thank you all for your kind attention. I apologize I have spoken long, but I would especially like to thank the organizers once again for giving me the opportunity to appear before you today to express the views of UNODC on these important questions, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts later today. Thank you.
Bom dia a todos e todas. Imagina uma conferência aqui em Brasil onde a gente pode falar em inglês. E como canadense, eu vou provar um pouco da oportunidade de falar em inglês, perdão. Mas it's an honor to be here today at the opening of this Brazilian Security Forum. And it's particularly an honor to be here sitting next to John Sandage, who comes representing the Treaty Division of the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime. So John works on aspects of international diplomacy, which seems a bit remote from this conversation that we often have amongst ourselves. But it's also an honor to be next to Elizabeth Leeds, who played a very important role, as you all know, in helping establish the Brazilian Security Forum. And I think it's to her we owe a lot of thanks for, in fact, being at these kinds of events. I am here as a partner of the forum. I represent the Instituto Igarapé in Rio de Janeiro. We're a small think tank that works on issues of security development, and we also are the Secretariat for the Global Commission on Drug Policy. And we work in Brazil, but we also work across Latin America. And there are three basic points I think I'd like to underline in Mr. Sandage's remarks that I hope all of us take away. And they're points that many of you will return to over the course of the next 2 days in your conversations. The first point I think that's worth underlining is that from the global to the local level, there is a widening acceptance of the conceptual, the normative, and the empirical relationships between security on the one side and development on the other. It seems obvious, perhaps, to all of you in the room, but it's not always obvious to international diplomats. But that greater insecurity can lead to declines or reductions in development. And it's also obvious, perhaps to many of you, but again, not obvious perhaps outside of the room, that certain forms of underdevelopment, poverty, inequality, lack of education, can have implications for a greater incidence and intensity of insecurity. And there's mounting evidence of this. We have data to support this relationship. And it comes from criminology, it comes from sociology, it comes from economics, it comes from geography, it comes from a whole vast range of disciplines that I think are represented in this room. The second point I think that's important to underline is that there's also a parallel recognition that security, justice, and governance, three pillar concepts, I think, to the Brazilian Security Forum, are not just a means to achieve development. They're also intrinsic ends in themselves. Around the world, again, this may seem obvious to you, but I think outside of this room it may be less so. Around the world, these aspirations of security and justice, personal security, access to justice, the means of justice, legal personality, are regarded increasingly as universal entitlements, and in some cases as rights. And Brazil, being a very important multilateral player in the global system, has signed up and ratified most of the conventions, the international conventions and treaties on these issues, from the Convention on Organized Crime in 2000, which it ratified in 2004, to the UN protocols on trafficking, to protocols and conventions on anti-corruption, to controls around the illegal trade in firearms, illegal trade and manufacturing of firearms, and many others. So not just a means, but an ends. The third point I think that Mr. Sandage made, which I think is very important to recall, is that while not always easy, it's today possible more than ever to measure the outcomes and impacts of security, justice, and governance, as well as the impacts of insecurity, injustice, and lack of governance. We have seen quite extraordinary methodological innovations and a data revolution in some of these sectors over the last few years, including here in Brazil. Some would say even that in Brazil is a leader in South America, if not across Latin America, in some of these innovations. And there's some consensus emerging around how to measure the outcomes and impacts of security, justice, and governance. So it's no longer possible for governments and leaders to say, oh, we can't measure these. We can't understand the cost-benefit of investing $1 in homicide reduction or $1 in prison reform. And so across Brazil, I think we have examples of extraordinary work around harnessing data, not just big data, but small data, to better understand the dynamics and impacts of security and justice. We have, for example, Pacto pela Vida, we have Fico Vivo, we have the programs in Canoas and Diadema, we have the new program here in São Paulo, which we'll see if it works or not, Detecta. There are many examples of new technologies emerging and new methodologies, and I think Brazil is at the forefront of this. So, the 3 points are that we have a growing conceptual awareness of the so-called security and development nexus or relationship. We appear to have a greater will to deliver security, justice, and governance to the world's peoples. And we have the tools, increasingly, to measure progress. And I think, as was made clear by Mr. Sandage, the Sustainable Development Goals, which, just to be clear, this is the next generation of development goals which will guide development for the next 15 years globally. And especially the 16th goal that's being discussed right now, in fact last week in the United Nations, bring these three factors together for the first time in an international forum. They bring a growing understanding of the concepts, a growing awareness of the importance of delivering on those concepts, and some discussion on the means to measure them. Goal 16 of the future Sustainable Development Goals, while not perfect, and it's not even necessarily final, because the UN won't agree on this for another 12 months. They're still in negotiations. It's a radical innovation, at least in the development world, perhaps not here in the security and justice world, but it's radical in the development world. 15 years ago, when I was working in the United Nations, and there was a process to set up Millennium Development Goals, the ideas of security and justice were introduced then, 15 years ago, by member states, but they were rebuffed. They were pushed away. They were seen to be too sensitive, too delicate, too political for governments to engage. There is a danger that next year, in 2015, this could happen again. There's a danger that in the General Assembly, in 12 months from now, when the states have to agree on a final set of development targets that will guide development for the next 15 years, that security, justice, and governance will be pushed out again 15 years later. So while we have tentative agreement amongst governments today in these priorities, we still need to support its development. As Mr. Sandage made clear, the SDGs represent, the Sustainable Development Goals represent a new kind of global framework. They emphasize collective responsibility on the part of governments around the world, and they're genuinely universal. And universality is very important. They're not just focused on the poorest parts of the world, in parts of Africa or parts of Asia. The future Sustainable Development Goals are supposed to be global. They apply to everybody equally. And what's very important about these goals, which many of you might be hearing about for the first time today, is the process by which they were developed. The goals were established through a bottom-up process. They weren't imposed from above. They're established based on thousands of conversations and consultations, including here in Brazil. And Brazil played an essential role in starting that conversation with the conference Rio Plus 20 that was held in Rio in 2012. Let me just consider Brazil in a bit more detail. As you know, all of you know, Brazil is today, by design and default, a major global player. It's the 7th largest economy in the world, and it's a member of many, many multilateral organizations, and is seen to be, I think, a multilateral player. Over the last decade, the Brazilian government has played an important role as a norm entrepreneur, as a norm maker in the United Nations. Itamaraty has conducted some quite clever diplomacy. Whether you like them or not is another issue, but they've been undertaking some clever diplomacy in the UN Secretariat, in the World Trade Organization, and in various regional organizations. But as you probably don't know, the Brazilian Foreign Ministry has also made a major contribution to securing this SDG 16, especially using language around promoting peace, access to justice, and governance. There are still big questions, and I think we still need to push the Brazilian government into taking on a more aggressive and promising and progressive role. But the future with Brazil looks more promising than ever. Far from New York, here in São Paulo, the debate on SDGs has only just started here in Brazil. After I canvassed a number of public security and justice experts, including members of the Fórum, I came to the conclusion that there is not very much known about this whole discussion in the United Nations about the future of development, or why ordinary Brazilians should care about it. I actually think that Brazil, and in particular the Brazilian Security Forum, has an essential role to play in ensuring that these global norms and concepts stick. But to do so, we need an informed debate here. Allow me to make two final remarks about some of the opportunities and challenges to advancing the debate in Brazil. First, I think there's a need to better link Brazil's domestic agenda around security, justice, and governance to its foreign policy agenda. There is a strange, for an outsider, although I'm an insider, I'm married to a Brazilian, I've got a Brazilian child, and I'm going to be here for a long time. But there is a strange, to me, division between the domestic discussion on security and justice and the international discussions on security and justice. I think the Brazilian Security Forum can work constructively to break down this artificial wall between the domestic and the international. And this isn't really that surprising when you think about it. The domestic public security and justice governance agenda is focused inward on the huge challenges here in Brazil. Not surprising, Brazil has the largest number of homicides in the world in absolute terms, 56,000, give or take. It has some extraordinary impunity rates that you all know about, above 80%. It has one of the world's largest prison populations. I think it's third or fourth. So who has time with all of these issues to think internationally? But meanwhile, Brazil's foreign policy establishment actually features some progressive elements, especially in relation to these issues around access to justice and governance. But it's entirely disconnected from the domestic discussion. How can Brazil advance peace abroad when there's such carnage at home? I think is a question that many people ask. But this gap can't continue, whether you ask that question or not. The historical, linguistic, and geographic barriers preventing domestic experts like you from acting globally are starting to disappear. Brazil is a global player, and the world is looking to hear more from Brazil. The Fórum and its partners, I think, can leverage a critical debate on the policies and practices that work here in Brazil around promoting security, justice, and governance that might be leveraged more broadly internationally. Second, and my last point, there is some, I would say, modest but growing willingness in the foreign policy establishment to engage more productively on these issues of public security, justice, and governance. And it's true, it's not always obvious what's going on in Brasilia, inside Itamaraty or outside. It's also true that Brazilian diplomacy has shied away from agendas that are, let's say, pro-security and justice in a sort of hard way. But judging from the fact that the SDG 16 that we've just discussed is still standing in the United Nations after months and months of negotiations means that there's appetite in Brasilia to engage this agenda. The fact is that some Brazilian diplomats have started adopting some of the language of public security, justice, prison reform, and various ideas in the global discussion. And as Mr. Sandage reminds us, in SDG 16, Sustainable Goal 16, Brazil supports the language explicitly of access to justice and anti-corruption. It also agrees with the targets of reducing lethal violence, which, as we know in Brazil, is probably the number one, if not close to the number one priority when it comes to public security. It's not always straightforward for public security, justice, and governance experts to engage with international diplomacy. There are challenges ahead, not least in relation to the basic concepts on the table. For example, Brazil and a handful of other countries in the ALBA, the Bolivian Alliance, and elsewhere, have trouble with the language of the rule of law, an English Anglo-Saxon construction, which is seen as a Western European or European construction with colonial undertones. So, notwithstanding some tensions around the language, and the language we use in this forum and the language we use in diplomacy, the point is that a constructive debate is possible, and I think the Fórum needs to start that discussion now. The Fórum and its partners, like UNODC and others, have a real opportunity now and over the next 12 months to influence global diplomacy and the future of development policy. In other words, the future of how governments around the world spend their resources on advancing development, one of the most fundamental objectives, you could say, of humanity. There is, for the first time in history, near universal consensus that safety, security, justice, and governance are public goods that are fundamental to development. This, I think, is an opportunity that we need to exploit. Even though we're focused inwards on Brazil, I think it's time that we also consider the global discussion. And the good news is that a growing number of Brazilian civil society organizations are already endorsing, I think, a minimum public security agenda that calls for things like homicide reduction, police reform and modernization, drug policy reform, and the construction of a new federal pact to promote safety for all. By meeting these minimum targets at home, Brazilian civil society, academics and experts, and local governments are sending a message, a positive message, for building peace, safety, and access to justice in the multilateral architecture of a global development agenda. So with that, I want to simply thank Mr. Sandage for his remarks and pass the floor back to Elizabeth to open it up for a discussion.
Bom, temos máximo 20 minutos para perguntas. Então, por favor, perguntas e comentários curtos para nossos palestrantes. Alguém vai?
Way in the back.
Bom dia, muito obrigado pela palestra. Tenho duas perguntas curtas. A primeira tem um ênfase muito grande em tudo que tem a ver com estatística e recoleção de dados e a medida da forma dos dados. A pergunta é como vocês pensam que pode ser feito uma coisa para entender melhor a experiência diária das pessoas que vivem essa violência que esses Big Data não consegue. E a segunda pergunta curta que grande parte do conceito de segurança e das políticas de segurança foi planejado ao lado da guerra contra as drogas que vem dos Estados Unidos. Acadêmicos, sociedade civil, políticos nos Estados Unidos e na região, aqui em Latinoamérica, estão falando fortemente que isso foi um grande fracasso. Não só porque não atingiu os objetivos, mas criou ou aprofundou problemas que já tinha lá, em muita forma. Se tem alguma se as instituições que vocês representam estão pensando em alternativas reais a essa guerra contra as drogas. Obrigado.
Eu queria pedir para as pessoas se identificaram.
Tá, meu nome é Sebastian, eu sou da Universidade de Flórida, nos Estados Unidos.
All right, thanks for those two questions. On the first one, the question of statistics, when I joined UNODC, which was 7 years ago, we talked about trying to set up a publication that we were going to call the World Crime Report that would sit alongside on the bookshelf the World Drug Report, which is a well-known and well-respected UNODC publication that most governments look to as pretty definitive on statistics related to drug abuse around the world. And we had real difficulty because we could not come up with a statistical methodology that worked across countries, because different countries classify crimes in different ways. And so what Rob mentioned is that until very recently, we really didn't have the ability to come up with workable measures on crime. But there's been a lot of progress in the last 7 years, and including in the area of security. And so I think now there are indicators that we can use that do give us a pretty good snapshot of the security situation in any given country or in any given region or across the world. I'll give you some specific examples. If you were asking UNODC to measure security in country X, the kinds of questions that we would ask would be, what's the rate of intentional homicide per 100,000 people? That's pretty standard. That's easy to measure. What are the number of direct deaths due to armed conflict per 100,000 people? What's the percentage of the adult population that in the last 12 months has been subjected to physical, psychological, or sexual violence? What's the proportion of the population who report in a survey that they feel safe walking in their neighborhood? What's the value in any given country of the illicit production and trafficking of drugs as an absolute number and as a percentage of GDP? Those are pretty easy to get numbers, and I think they give you some indication in any given country about what's the security situation facing the populace. So I do think we can measure some of these concepts, although I agree it's a challenge, but I think we're really working towards some good numbers. On the second question about the failure of the so-called war on drugs, there is actually right now going on in the UN a very interesting debate that goes back to first principles on the question of international drug control policy. The international drug treaty regime dates back 50 years to 1961, and virtually every government in the world is a party to that convention. I think that convention's been widely misunderstood. I think there's been a perception that that convention required governments to criminalize the use of drugs, and it doesn't. What it requires is for governments to criminalize the illegal sale and trafficking in drugs. But the approach the convention takes and UNODC takes to the individual drug user is that drug addiction is not a moral flaw, it's a health problem. It's an addiction. And addictions are not treated by putting people in jail, they're treated by putting people into counseling programs, if need be, into a hospital, getting them into methadone treatment. There are a lot of medical interventions and social and psychological interventions that can help people move away from drugs. But the debate that's going on right now in the UN is whether the Drug Control Convention should be revisited. And there is a process that is known by the acronym UNGAS, UN General Assembly Special Session on World Drug Policy. And we're getting ready for the next UNGAS, which will be in a couple of years. But this year at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, we began the debate about what the international drug control regime should look like for the coming years. And there were there were some governments in this region, about a half a dozen, who really invited the process to go back to first principles and rethink the conventions. And that process will go forward over the next several years. It will be picked up again in the General Assembly this fall. It will come back to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs next spring. But there is space for this discussion. And it's not just a discussion amongst government delegations. There's space for civil society. There's space for the academic community. And all viewpoints are welcome. And we're talking about these things. Where this conversation will end up, I can't say, but the conversation's begun. Thanks.
Elizabeth, can I have just one quick intervention?
Uma-
Just one very quick intervention. The issue of metrics is hugely important and extremely controversial. I think often we sanitize it as scholars or academics or as police or justice officials, but actually how we measure a problem informs how we design solutions and how much money we put into those solutions. And there's an expression, we often measure what we treasure. And it's often what we don't measure which can matter fundamentally. And I think your question, just to complement what John Sandage, how John Sandage responded, was how do we capture in a way how people really feel? Not necessarily just administrative data or big data, which tends to be quite remote, but how do we get people's sentiment? How do we get at people's real lived experience? And I think that's a challenge. The first thing I'd say is there has been a great evolution or revolution in the collection of administrative data on simple crime and justice statistics. It was only a couple of years ago that the UNODC was able to publish national homicide rates. It used to be regionally aggregated homicide rates because governments felt it was too sensitive to talk publicly about homicide in the UN Forum. So the very fact of having a national homicide rate publicized by the United Nations, that's actually, it shows you, A, how polemic the issue of indicators are, but B, also that we've made some evolutions. The second point is that there is a big debate right now underway in the post-215 discussion, but also outside of it, about perception data, about using opinion polls, about using social media, big data or small data. Taking big data, in other words, taking the total sample of a population, or small data being taking a generalized sample, a small representative sample from which we can generalize. And there is a big debate. Now, governments, many of them, are really resistant to using perception data. And you might see why. Why would a government want to know exactly what its citizens think about the state of security, justice, and governance? Do they really want to? Do they want that publicized? Some might, but others won't. And so I think there is a big discussion about the fact that we can now do that. We can collect perception-based data, but there's political reasons why we may not take it on board. The final point around the war on drugs, the only thing I would say about that, and I won't be speaking institutionally on behalf of necessarily, I'll be speaking in my own personal capacity on this. But I think that if you look at the metrics that are being used in the war, the so-called war on drugs, I think there's a recognition that they're the wrong metrics. They're supply-driven metrics. Is it appropriate to measure success in dealing with drug consumption, illicit drug consumption, by looking at fumigation, by looking at the tons of drugs seized, by looking at the price of drugs on the street, by looking at the number of arrests? I mean, these are the conventional metrics that we've been using, and they play well politically. They play well to public the public because we can see something's being done. I think what's happening now increasingly in and outside of the UN is a rethinking of the metrics towards less supply-driven metrics to more demand-driven metrics and impact metrics, and putting health at the center of the discussion. So reducing violence, that sounds like a good way of limiting the consequences of drugs. Reducing harms caused by drugs from consumption-related harms. Thinking about only going after the high-level drug actors and not the lower-level traffickers. So thinking differently about metrics. And I think there is a discussion underway as I said, inside and outside of the UN. It's a difficult discussion. It's not an easy discussion. There's a lot of challenges around thinking it through. But I think it's ongoing, and it's an exciting discussion. And hopefully, if we start changing the metrics by which we measure a problem, we might be able to actually tackle that problem differently.
Próxima pergunta.
Bom dia a todos e a todos. Meu nome é Carolina Ricardo, eu sou do Instituto Sou da Paz, aqui de São Paulo. A primeira coisa, eu gostaria muito, acho que é muito importante valorizar esse debate, né, de vincular desenvolvimento à segurança pública. Acho que isso a gente vive no dia a dia, a gente sabe que a violência e a insegurança têm um impacto no desenvolvimento das cidades e da sociedade como um todo, mas essa é uma discussão que, do ponto de vista conceitual, ainda precisa avançar, e fazer essa discussão aqui no Fórum é fundamental. A gente precisa parar de separar as áreas, desenvolvimento de um lado e segurança pública do outro, e começar a olhar esses dois temas de forma integrada. E acho que aí tem um desafio importante que o Rob aponta, que é um desafio de como trazer essa discussão para mais próxima da realidade das pessoas, né? As pessoas vivem esse dilema, né? A gente percebe no dia a dia das cidades que a falta de segurança impacta o desenvolvimento e a falta de desenvolvimento impacta na segurança. Mas como é que a sociedade pode se apropriar dessa discussão de forma menos abstrata e mais concreta? Eu acho que essa é uma discussão, é um desafio importante. E aí a minha pergunta é se em outros países em que essa discussão já avançou, se houve alguma estratégia específica de comunicação, de discussão com a sociedade para aproximar o tema da sociedade. Porque acho que se a sociedade se apropriar dessa discussão, nomear melhor o impacto e a relação entre segurança e desenvolvimento, a agenda ganha força e a gente consegue, inclusive, pressionar o governo. Então, uma pergunta, quer dizer, se há experiências em outros países de aproximação desse debate à sociedade. E uma sugestão, quer dizer, já que a gente começa a fazer essa discussão envolvendo acadêmicos e especialistas, também envolver os operadores do sistema de justiça e segurança, os policiais, representantes do sistema de justiça, porque são pessoas que têm cada vez mais se desenvolvido pesquisas e estudos nessa área, vivem o dia a dia, o resultado dessa falta de relação entre segurança e desenvolvimento, e podem muito ajudar a contribuir nesse debate para que o Brasil assuma a agenda de segurança pública na discussão das metas do milênio.
I don't come here to tell you how to have your own public debate, and I'm sure you don't need my guidance. Brazil has a wide open press and a wide open political culture. Aristotle famously said that politics is the conversation of the peoples in the marketplace. And clearly you're already having this discussion, or you wouldn't have invited me here. Different governments have this discussion in different ways. I would say the view of UNODC is what I indicated, that we see very clear linkages between security, rule of law, good governance, and advancing international development. But there are other views. You can't argue that it's a direct correlation between a high rate of development and a low rate of violence. I mean, for example, my own government, the United States is very well developed, but we have, in my view, an unacceptably high level of gun violence that the government is not prepared to address. But I think generally speaking, if you are looking at the question of economic and social development, you're trying to set up a situation in which government and the private sector can work together to try to bring things along. And it's very difficult for governments to build schools and hospitals in a situation of violence and instability. It's very difficult to get international investors to come into a country or into a region where there's high levels of violence and instability, where there's corruption, where there are judicial institutions that can't be relied upon to render fair decisions. So every government will have this discussion, and every government will come to its own position. And I think the important thing is not what that position is, but that position is the outcome of a discussion that considers all different perspectives and viewpoints. And I think that's what's going on around the world. It's tempting for outsiders to maybe dismiss the SDGs as kind of some trivial UN process that is just putting words on paper that no one will ever pay any attention to. But if you go back and look at the last 15 years since the Millennium Summit, when the MDGs were identified, you can see genuine areas where the world has gotten better, where fewer children die in infancy, where there's better access to schools, where hospitals have been built, where roads have been built, where people are able to lead their lives without worrying about going out their front door. So we have made progress, and I think the next 15 years we're going to see a lot more progress. And the most important thing is that we all march forward together, and I'm convinced that that's what will happen a year from now when the SDGs have been finally settled. Thanks.
Meu nome é Inácio Cano, eu sou professor da Universidade do Estado do Rio de Janeiro. Eu queria perguntar para o senhor John Sandage o seguinte: a sua organização, a Organização das Nações Unidas sobre Droga e Crime, representa uma visão tradicional da droga como um problema criminal. Essa visão está sendo questionada hoje em dia, e o senhor mesmo já falou da importância de um olhar mais do ponto de vista da saúde em relação às drogas. Então, na medida que esse questionamento continuar, pareceria razoável imaginar que a Organização das Nações Unidas que se ocupa das drogas não fosse a mesma da organização que se ocupa do crime. Então, a pergunta é se existe alguma discussão nas Nações Unidas, nesse sentido, sobre a conveniência de separar os dois mandatos que estão hoje sob a sua organização.
Thanks for that question. No, there's not. In fact, it hasn't been too long since the two mandates were pushed together. It used to be that the UN had a drug control program and a crime program, and about 1992, 94, somewhere around there, before I joined, the two were combined together. But I think it is possible to separate the issue of the use of drugs as an individual problem, and it's a medical problem, it's a social problem, it's an economic problem, from how you deal with the phenomenon of organized criminality that facilitates it and then makes money off of it. And so, as I indicated earlier, the approach that we take in addressing the organized criminality part, the drug trafficking part, the money laundering part, the corruption part, that's a criminal justice response. And that's mostly handled in my division, which is the legal division, the treaty affairs division. The issue of how we address compassionately the problem of the drug user and the ways in which drugs negatively affect and ultimately can ruin the lives of individual people and can affect their families and by extension their communities, that's dealt with from the perspective of health. It's dealt with from the perspective of physicians we have on staff, psychologists we have on staff, and they design programs that we think are fully consistent with the international conventions, but that takes a humane, public health, human rights-centered approach to addressing the problem, and I'm convinced that that's the right way to proceed. Thanks.
Bom, como nosso tempo é curto, temos tempo para mais uma pergunta e convido vocês para conversar com os palestrantes depois, durante o coffee break.
Testando.
Bom dia, meu nome é Vitor, eu sou aluno do doutorado em Sociologia na Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, natural de São Paulo, então aqui também estou em casa. A minha pergunta vai dirigida a uma provocação que foi colocada a respeito de métricas menos supply-driven e mais demand-driven. E quando essa provocação surge, ela vem, talvez eu esteja enganado, mas a pergunta vai nessa direção, numa separação, estaria ou não essa ideia de supply-driven mais ligada à visão estatal e a demand-driven mais ligada à dimensão social, para fora das instituições do Estado. E a pergunta se relaciona, ela se justifica pela seguinte questão. Em trabalhos de campo, nós pesquisamos, eu sou do Grupo de Violência e Cidadania, da Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, e em trabalhos de campo junto a policiais, policiamento comunitário, enfim, em diversos estados, não apenas no Rio Grande do Sul, mas outros estados, a gente consegue detectar a percepção dos atores, enquanto agentes do Estado, sensibilizados para questões que seriam mais proximidade com a comunidade e a percepção da sensibilidade das pessoas a respeito do que são os problemas que os afligem em relação à segurança pública. Isso está presente. Isso não. Então, eu colocaria esse cenário com uma pergunta objetiva: quais seriam as possibilidades, quais seriam os caminhos possíveis para a gente pensar soluções criativas para vencer resistências, até mesmo dentro dos atores e diversos setores do debate sobre a segurança pública, para que visões que existam e visões que existem dentro da própria polícia, em diversos estados, possam encontrar canais para vencer resistências em relação à reforma da polícia, por exemplo. Obrigado.
I'm honestly not sure I got the question, but let me take a stab at it, and if I didn't, you can come back and ask me again. Traditionally, the approach that the international community took to the problem of drugs was that it was a supply problem, that it was a problem of the countries that actually grew opium or grew cocaine or grew cannabis. And so the focus was on them solving the problem. But that perception has shifted dramatically in the last 15 or 20 years. And now, at least in the United Nations, we take a balanced approach that, yes, supply is a problem. If the drugs weren't available, people wouldn't use them. But no, it's not simply the fault of the governments that have in their territory people growing and trafficking drugs, because if there was no demand for the drugs, people wouldn't raise them. So it has to be a bipolar approach. You have to look at the problem of supply, but you also look at the problem of demand and of prevention. And we try to be very give great attention to that dichotomy. And if you look at the World Drug Report, for example, which we issue every year, we have just as many statistics about the supply side of the equation as we do about demand. And in many respects, governments pay more attention to the demand side, because when they see that, for example, the use of cocaine in the United States is going up, or the use of heroin in the Benelux countries is going up, or the number of ecstasy tablets that are found crossing the border between the Russian Federation and Belarus is going up. These are concerns, and these are not only supply concerns, they're demand concerns, and both sides of the equation have to be responded to by the government in order to solve the problem of drugs. I'm not sure if that gets where you wanted to go, but that's as much as I understood. But
I can just try quickly. Very quickly.
Very
I mean, just to, I think I also understood a little the question. Just to re-emphasize that the war on drugs kind of model has, in a way, has a lot of conditionalities and incentives to encourage states to comply with the war on drugs model. So in the United States, there was issues around scheduling and ensuring that countries that were earmarked for support for dealing with drugs had to conform and meet certain metrics of success in order to sustain that support or have access to privileged trade relationships or other forms of connections. So, as you say, it was a very statist model. So the United States, a number of other countries, I can say this because I don't work for the United Nations, but a number of countries would emphasize a very statist approach to the war on drugs. And the metrics that were used to measure success were supply-driven, I think for the same reasons that John described, and focused on producing countries. And so states that receive support from the United States and Europe would subscribe to the metrics that were being introduced and use those. And I think that influenced, in many ways, federal and state government positions on how you measure and gauge success in prosecuting the war on drugs. I think what's interesting, to get to your question, though, in order to change a little bit the paradigm, in order to rethink that paradigm, is to go back a little bit first to the original conventions and remember that health was central to the conventions. Preserving the health of people and the integrity of their person is central to the concept of the drug regime, whether it needs reforming or not. And I think that in order to help state-level and city-level authorities think differently about drugs, it's about putting that paradigm back in the center, the health and integrity of the individual and the rights of the individual, as opposed to the drugs and the supply and the trafficking and the transit. So thinking about the health. And I think we're seeing some really interesting examples of this in Brazil, but also in Colombia and elsewhere, where local authorities are starting to talk about violence reduction as opposed to going after the drugs only and seizing drugs and using those metrics and having that famous lineup of all the drugs with the photo taken and that being on the front page of the newspaper. Instead, the metrics of success to gauge and incentivize police operations is around reducing violence, dealing humanely with consumers, going after the high-level organized crime, not the low-level traffickers, thinking differently about the human rights and the human safety and the human health. And I think that is the starting point. And I think most police would agree fundamentally with that. I think many police see an advantage in having tighter, more community-based relationships with the communities in which they work. They know that an aggressive, standoffish, repressive approach isn't functioning and limits their ability to do the day-to-day work. So I think reversing that paradigm towards one that values life rather than being seduced by collecting drugs, I think would be a really positive way forward.
Para uma discussão muito rica. Muito obrigada.